today, Professor Noemi Levy and Professor Jan Toporowski are going to present us their works. So first, I'm going to introduce Professor Noemi Levy. She's a very important figure here at the Mexican academic, and I think in the world. She has been one of the most important Kaleckian here at our university. She's always all the time very active, and we really appreciate her work. And of course, with his partner in crime, is, as may say, Professor Jan Toporowski. They have been working together for a long time. I don't know how much, but maybe 1 or 2 years. No, a long time. But well, I'm going to give the microphone to Professor Noemi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizer. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor. And sorry, I was asked to speak in English. It's a sort of undocumented English, but I'll try my best for my accent not to interfere with the ideas. Today, I want to revisit the lectures that Kalecki wrote in Mexico in 1953. Yeah, and my main argument is that structural balances continue to be a problem in Mexico after 70 years that this document was written, which we had the industrialization model and the export-led model. Actually, Latin Americans may know of Van Silver, that he wrote or he posed the issue of truncate and industrialization because it didn't have there were two empty boxes in his model, which were technological innovation and social exclusion. Another point that I want to make very forcible, that economic backwardness is not an outcome of a particular development model, neither it's inevitable. It's a result of economic policy decisions that perpetuate underdevelopment, reflecting alliances between big domestic capital interests subordinated to transnational capital, neutralizing the Schumpeterian entrepreneurial spirit. So I will discuss what has been the main structural problem in the economy during this period. What are the main paradoxes of the Mexican economy? Production and exports are concentrated in high medium technological sectors, which coexist with domestic capital goods and intermediate goods sector very, very weak. And the second issue is that liquidity in the Mexican economy increases, like excessive liquidity now, without developing capital markets. Therefore, funding is not done in local currency. The main argument here is that the sins of the Mexican economy are high profits in relation to developed economies, not reinvested in the productive sector, sustained by public subsidies and low labor costs. This prevented the expansion of domestic markets and contributed to high income concentration. I will go now a bit in the middle. You won't go asleep with me saying what Kalecki wrote. I will pinpoint the important parts. The assumption, I think, is very important that inflation is explained by cost, mainly due to productive imbalances. Influence, obviously, the issue of the degree of monopoly is important here. The other important thing, capital spending determines economic growth, and if work is safe, demand is restricted. I'm not explaining. And capital spending is all capital spending explains capital is saving, and it always will go, but it has economic cycles. The important causalities are capital spending determines profit, investment determines capital saving, and capital saving also determines wages and salaries. So determines the so-called production sector. Also, it's important that capital saving is the primary source of investment finance, which determines the amount of credits and rentier capital, and its cost mediated by the financial risk. Not going into it, and I think there is a nice discussion by Tracy Mott in between covered finance and uncovered finance. As it says in the first one is secured by entrepreneurial capital that has no risk or little risk, and the covered finance has higher risk because it's not backed by entrepreneurial capital. This argument leads to a very important issue for us, that economic growth had different growth rates between big and small enterprises and between developed and non-developed economy. So this is important for us. I'm not going into the investment determinants. I'm only saying that it's capital savings, profits, and capital. And I think in this discussion is very important the determinants of investment innovations, which I'm not going to deal here, it's in the paper. What are the challenges according to Kalecki of backward economies? He spoke about structural bottlenecks in the productive sector, supply inelasticity, partial regulation of capital saving, and all the issue of how is finance imports. It's not the problem of financing economic growth, it's in terms of external sector. What are, according to it, the sources of supply bottlenecks? Food production inelasticity. I think this was done because of his discussion on that he wanted agricultural reform. Today is something different, that he pointed out this. When you have a higher level productivity in the industrial sector with not enough effective demand. Then you get these relations, I'm not going to explain them, higher investment, higher employment, higher food product demand, higher prices, and industrial demand falls. What happens is that the peasants or the part in the countryside that get this higher income, they can use it to buy industrial goods, and industrialization doesn't have any problem, but usually these people can save or can increase their imports, and then industrialization is truncated, if I can use Van Silver's words. Also, he has a discussion of higher productivity in the industrial sector and how it will affect, at the end of the day, effective demand, especially in the case when workers' payments or investment demand doesn't grow. So there is a problem. I'm not going to go into that. And the degree of monopoly, which is a big problem for us, because usually it's the degree of monopoly, FDIs control these sectors. They can raise profit margins, prices, reduce effective demand. Therefore, they operate with a high degree of obsolete, and also they operate with obsolete technology. It's something that Rimauro Marini used to speak a lot of it. So the realization of industrial good is prevented, and export competitiveness is very low, hindering the process of industrialization. There is also an interest, a discussion in this paper about terms of trade. I don't want to take it literally, but the financial sector hinders today economic development in different ways. Not exactly as Kalecki posed it, but it's an important contribution. I'm not going to go, I think everyone knows this concept, so I prefer to use my time in other things. Here is all his discussion of who can finance imports, which is, he liked FDIs because you can pay them with dividends. He didn't like the issue of interest, and he didn't like the political condition. I think today he will change his mind. Anyway, there is a lot of problems, as we know, with FDI. They tend to concentrate in the dynamic sector, create development hubs, which don't integrate the rest of the economy, usually operates with outdated technology or very low investment, which is another problem, and productivity is very low. It leads to high market concentration, driving up prices, and weakens the income multiplier effect due to profit repatriation and how interest outflows. I come to Mexico now. Perhaps this will be the most interesting part. Here, I just put some dates, which has been important in the Mexican industrialization. When it started as a spontaneous project. It became then a state policy. It had a stable period, high income growth with stable prices. Then we got all the issue of instability, very much related with the instability of the external sector. 82, it was finished. Then we got the deregulation, globalization, and I use the term of internationalization is when the Mexican economy really got linked to the international economy, especially with our problem with our friends in the north, having 3,000 kilometers border. Here are the different important days that needs to be accounted. Then I went to the figures. What I found is in macroeconomically, here we have what happened between the easy period and the export days period. Here 67, 679, 1990, and 1218. I didn't want to put all the COVID issue and the new government because it changes a bit the discussion. Pardon, sorry. So what we have, economic growth, fell in the export-led model. A third of the previous model. Here you have it in red. It's amazing. The second thing which is important, export became the main spending of GDP above investment. This meant that export are higher than investment, and this is one of our problems today. The weight share in GDP slightly reduced, and obviously the operating surplus increased in terms of GDP. Here you see the productivity, it really went down. And I would argue that the similarities between in these two periods were that manufacturers were relatively constant. And secondly, investment didn't increase in the export level model. And historically or structurally, we have foreign account deficits. This has been one of the characteristics, not only of Mexico, I would argue from Latin America. What is the problem in the productive sector? I think we know that the primary sector, the primary sector shrunk in the 70s. The secondary sector hasn't changed much. And funnily enough, look at the red line, which is the manufacturer GDP ratio. Relatively stable, whatever economic model do you have. And here I put a statistic that we just found, that is the intensity, investment intensity of the manufacturing sector. We have it only from 1992, and here we have another strange thing. It doesn't change much before NAFTA and after NAFTA. This is a bit struggling. Obviously, I need to see what happened with investment, The growth rate of investment declined a bit between 60s and 80s, stabilized in the 2000s, but it hasn't changed dramatically. Here, then we get, it moves along. Productivity declined, as I said, by GDP, and investment growth really reduced, came down in terms of rate of growth, particularly through the export-based model. What's important in this sense is that employment growth fell much less than GDP. What does it mean? That productivity relies on labor occupation. So there is not much intensification nor investment spending, especially in the second period. Here are the investment coefficient, the only thing I want to share, relatively constant. Construction was the main driver investment, and machinery and equipment usually is determined by imports. This is important in terms of what the capital good is very weak, and the intermediate good is very weak. In spite that we have very high manufacture production for high and medium sectors. External sector, which is the Mexican Achilles heel, if I may say, yeah, historically current account deficits, which reflects two issues: negative trade balances, and secondly, negative factorial balances. So it's not only from the trade, but from the remittance and the interest rate. This was especially in the 80s. Another problem, export and import competition. Export increased in the 1980s, driven initially by the petrol sector and followed by the manufacture. Imports expanded more or less by the 1990s, dominated by capital goods from then onwards and intermediate goods. So we didn't develop these sectors. Export by technological intensity is quite interesting. It has been high, it started to be high, representing more or less the half of the exports with some technology from the medium and high tech export. This happens from the 70s. It's not new from the 1990s. It was from before. So here we have another problem. Well, here the real exchange rate, as we have been saying, exchange rate movements actually they control inflation, but they don't make much of a change. I know there is the exchange rate, if we devalue it here, we cannot increase domestic production because we don't have the industries to switch production. So this is the sense of it. And here I go to the issue of financial openness and capital internationalization, which somehow will explain the structural disequilibrium in the Mexican economy from the 2000 onwards. Usually, and here this is very important, that capital inflows are above a current account needs of finance led by foreign investors. So here we get that our financial account is much more higher than our current account. So this is what I call excessive liquidity in the Mexican economy, that we get a lot of foreign investment that doesn't go into the productive sector and stays in the circulation and gives a lot of problems to the economy. If you see liabilities, the part of liability here in red, initially they were dominated by foreign portfolio. After the 1994 crisis, it switched to FDIs. Yes, and FDI dominated after NAFTA and is installed mostly in dynamic sectors, not being able to put domestic sector production. So they're isolated, and in this way they can increase, but the GDP increases much less. with dependence of foreign technology and finance. Multinationals we'll see next that don't finance in the Mexican economy. It's all done inside the corporation or multilatinals finance in the financial centers. In the asset side here, we have multilatinals. Multilatinals from Latin America, obviously, expand to access the financial centers. And this is increasing even more financial dependence because, for instance, in Mexico, they are the ones that issue more bonds and in the international bond market, and it means external debt. So it is done now by the private sector, not the public sector. And this is important because at the end, the public sector, we have to back, if there is a default, the private sector debt. Here, a bit more of how FDI are composed. Merger and acquisition are relevant, but also greenfield investment. FDIs to investment represent more or less half of total investment, and greenfield about 1/3. So whatever investment is in Mexico, it comes importantly for FDIs, but it's sort of very backward technology. And mergers and acquisition from multilatinals are relatively, it's around 2%. Here we have the capital market, the bond market, and it's quite clearly that our capital market has very few listed enterprises. The capitalization value is not high. The new commercial shares are not important. Something doesn't work. How you go back? Sorry. And look at the turnover share. It's extremely low. The secondary market is sleeping very nicely here. And then we have the bonds market. And here it's important that the non-financial firms, sorry about that, non-financial firms have been increasing the bonds issuances in the international market quite heavily. And we have sort of the government bonds, its rate of growth has been low. It hasn't been increased too much. They want to be away of the international market center. So here, I hope I haven't used much of my time. I get to my conclusions. First, the neoclassical argument that saving determines investment is rejected by Kalecki, and we can reject it still in today's financial institutions on the basis that capitalism requires capital to be capitalist, and government intervention, public spending, can be activate economic growth. Let me only say one thing, which there is a big discussion in Mexico today. The more Keynesian scholars argue that deficit really should go up. We have a problem. We are an extremely open country, and our interest rate will go very high if all this international, how you call it, agency will look over there and say it's too dangerous. So we have limited impact of how much deficit, a public deficit with that. This is a big problem that we have, not that we don't want to, but I think that institutional problem that prevents doing that. Secondly, inflation is a monetary variable, but it is not explained by monetary factors. It's due to the productive elasticity, and I would say that its main problem is that we don't have productive, high value added productive sectors. Capital markets, investment, and intermediate goods. The famous Department 1 of Kalecki in Mexico is very, very low. Obviously, there are distributive conflicts. Yeah, Mexico has a very high income concentration, and actually could rise the minimum wage more than 100%, and nothing happened. So there is a lot of policy that can be made along these lines. What are Mexico's main rigidities, which are explained by the current account deficit? And I would say, as my ongoing argument is, underdevelopment of the capital and intermediate goods center, low investment, and low capital intensity. It's not only low investment, but investment is with no innovation. So there is a problem to go up to the trend. High manufacture participation from technological intensive medium sector based on labor intensive organization, the famous maquila. Yeah, I think FDI, Mexico cannot break the trade agreement with the United States because we will have a problem in the north and in the center of extremely high unemployment. So this is a problem, and it's not so easy sort of to break and start again because you have this middle path that you need to organize. So there is a big argument that still we are fighting what to do. Multinational operate as enclaves. We go back to the beginning of the 20th century that you have these big FDIs in the mining sector, in the raw material sector, with no connections in terms of employment, technology, and whatever, with the domestic sector. I was brought up with the dependentista theory, which explained this very thoroughly. Why? And the important issue is that the multilateral, our big corporation, have very weak operations in the financial sector and in the productive sector with the parent companies. Our multilatinals, what they do is go outside by mergers and acquisition, new firms, and operate within the foreign capital sector. They don't link, as in the car industry, with their parents. So there is a problem. And obviously, they even don't look at the financial domestic market. High foreign external dependence, exchange rate become a monetary variable highly dependent on foreign capital movement, while terms of trade cycles are determined by developed economies. Here, remember that we are price takers also in our imports. The story of ECLAC is very, it's told by Kalecki, but in a different way. So there's the other problems that we have, and monetary policy, objective of controlling price in Mexico. I'm not very sure about this, about the other Latin American countries, but the central bank has an intermediate objective, which is to control the exchange rate. Why? Because the devaluation brings inflation without increasing domestic product, and overvaluation stabilizes prices. However, to have big overvaluation may make us more vulnerable to any changes in the rest of the world. For instance, now with Trump's that will put tariffs, if we are a bit under double, it is good, because we can, it gives us room for not to affect the internal economy. Excess of liquidity international unit as a result, for financial globalization and capital internationalization has not developed the capital market, and we lack of long-term funding or long-term finance in domestic unit. And this is a problem, yeah, because the monetary policy doesn't deal with, all our monetary policy is dependent on industrial countries. And this is the end of the story. Thank you for listening.
You want me to put the other presentation? ¿Quiere que ponga la otra presentación? ¿O se la puede? Well, I think we can wait until the end to get questions or comments for both presentations. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, I know.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Sí.
Well, thank you very much. Now we're gonna go for the presentation of Professor Jan Toporowski. Of course, he is here because he has a lot of information of our main character of this conference, Kalecki, and I think it's gonna be very useful for us to see this presentation, which looks to link Kalecki and a structuralist. So I'm gonna give him the microphone. We have, like, I think, enough time until 5 p.m. So we can go for 20 minutes or 25 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And also for inviting me to commemorate this event. I think I would say is on a personal level that for Kalecki, coming to Mexico to deliver his lecture on financing economic development was a very important experience. Kalecki was feeling at the time Kalecki was working at the UN, and he was feeling isolated there, isolated because of the political developments within the United States and how they were affecting the UN. And this was an opportunity for him to put forward many of the ideas that were he had developed there at the UN with a degree of greater freedom than he could at the UN. So from a personal point of view, it is an important paper, and I'm very delighted to have the opportunity to be here and talk some more about it. Let me go through some of what I will talk about today. First of all, I'll make some remarks about Kalecki's theoretical model, the concepts that he wanted to put forward for his analysis. Secondly, I'll say a few words about structuralist development economics, the way in which the development economics, particularly in Latin America, emerged and became a system of ideas for policy on economic development. And I'll say something about Kalecki's visit to Cuba, and which I think is particularly important for highlighting some of the differences between Kalecki and some of the structuralists in Latin America, and then finally, by way of conclusion, mention some lessons for today and also differences between when Kalecki was writing and now, highlighting some of those. Okay, Kalecki's theoretical model. I'm very much of the view that when Kalecki was thinking about an economy, he had in mind a system of monetary circulation. He saw it not as a set of variables which were determined by other variables, which is the standard textbook explanation of models, but it was actually a model of monetary circulation, ultimately derived from Marx's schemes of reproduction, but also from Rosa Luxemburg's development of those schemes of reproduction, and interestingly enough, the way in which she brought the developing countries into the analysis of those schemes of reproduction. At the core was a version of his theoretical model, is a version of his theory of profits. This is an idea based on Marxist schemes of reproduction, but you can equally well put it forward in a two-sector model of the economy, two or three-sector model of the economy. It was essentially, which Keynes did in his Harris lectures in Chicago, which shows in an industrialized economy, in an economy with only capitalists and workers, that profits are essentially determined by the amount that capitalists spend on investment and on their own consumption. In this sense, Kalecki considered that investment is self-financing, and he mentions this explicitly. He mentioned this explicitly in his 1953 paper. In other words, exposed by the time that money has circulated through the economy, it winds up as savings, and effectively the financial resources needed to finance that investment. So the financial resources for investment do themselves appear after that investment is made. So you have what Kalecki elsewhere referred to as a technical problem of intertemporal transfers, a problem which he thought was resolved. I mean, this was the function of the money markets, was to resolve this technical problem. But in the end, however much money is spent on investment, that money will wind up in a capitalist economy, will wind up in the pockets of capitalists, not necessarily the ones that have done the investment, but a wind up in the pockets of the capitalists, so that in this respect, it is self-financing. The problem in developing countries is that the economy is not just made up of entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial capitalists, and workers. It's also made up of what we might generally called pre-capitalist wealthy classes, landowners, merchants, or traditional money lenders, for whom the profits, the money generated by investment and any fiscal deficits and trade surpluses ends up in their pockets through this process of monetary circulation. And because these people are not entrepreneurs, what do they do with the money? They use it for luxury consumption, and part of that luxury consumption is very often imports. This then, otherwise they just accumulate this money, and you have a problem of excess liquidity and what comes with the excess liquidity is the possibility of capital flight. That at some point, particularly if there's inflation or fear of inflation or financial instability, as we know as Latin Americans know perfectly well, the way to avoid all that is to dollarize your savings. You keep your money in dollars. So for Kalecki, there is a problem that the people who obtain the money from investment have no particular interest in reinvesting that money. It really has to be done much more directed by the state, or it may be done by multinationals. If it's done by foreign companies, then really the government loses control of the process. But maintaining financial stability over this monetary circulation is really a fiscal issue. It's a fiscal issue because it requires not just the government to spend the money on investment or infrastructure or public services, but it means that that money, once it's accumulated in the pockets of these pre-capitalist wealthy classes, needs to be removed by taxing them, or if you tax, not necessarily removed, but the very fact of a recurrent tax on wealth obliges wealthy people to hold a proportion of their assets, in liquid form, ready to pay for those taxes. So it's a way, to some extent, of stabilizing hoards of wealth. And Kalecki in his paper puts forward what he considered to be the basic factor causing inflation in developing countries, which is the inelasticity of supplies of basic necessities. Kalecki was very aware that in developing countries are characterized by the fact that the majority of the population live in poverty. The first thing that poor people do when if they receive an increase in their income is to feed themselves adequately, or to buy adequate basic necessities, for example, improving their housing, getting better clothes. these are, for the most part, locally produced. And the difficulty that Kalecki identified, and he identified this not just in the 1950s in his work at the UN, but he'd identified this as a problem back in the 1930s, that if you do not have land reform, if farming, if agricultural land is rented from landowners, then if there's a higher demand for food, there's a tendency for food prices to rise, farmers' incomes rise, and the landowners take this away with higher rents, or the farmers use the money to repay the loans that they've taken out, because poor farmers are typically in debt. So you need to undertake land reform. There's the outstanding example of this later on in Kalecki's lifetime was the case of India and the land reform and the associated Green Revolution in the Punjab, which effectively fed India through the course, through its industrial development in the 1950s and the 1960s. That's a relatively rare example. Elsewhere, this hasn't happened because of the power of landowners. The other bottleneck, which eventually comes to play a part, is the foreign exchange constraint. That as a development boom extends, more this imports rise, particularly imports of raw material and capital equipment, and this is a charge on the balance of payments, and eventually the balance of payments turns negative, and the government has to borrow or in some way restrict imports. Let me now say something about the structuralist development economics at that time, at the time when Kalecki was writing this, and subsequently into the 1960s. This was a period when the markets were to some extent international commodity markets were coordinated to maintain the stability of raw material commodities, but it gave rise to the phenomenon known as the Prebisch-Singer thesis or hypothesis, a situation with combined with the with currency exchange rate stability enforced by the International Monetary Fund, where the prices of manufactured or processed products tended to rise more rapidly than the prices of commodity exports of the developing countries. And this gave rise to a growing sense in developing countries that the system that they were being disadvantaged in international trade. This was a structural obstacle to their development because they couldn't accumulate the resources. It was much more difficult to accumulate the resources that they needed for development because the manufactured goods that they were importing kept rising in price relative to the commodities, the raw materials commodities and food commodities, and agricultural commodities that those countries were exporting. A second element of this structuralist development economics was the belief that manufactured products benefit from economies of scale and were organized in industrial monopolies where the developing country firms cannot and could not compete. Despite formal commitments to free trade, it was difficult for developing countries to break into the markets of the industrialized countries. Out of this structuralist development economics came as the solution of imposing trade barriers, capital controls to prevent capital flight, and import substitution, effectively expanding demand behind tariff barriers and capital controls to effectively force domestic development. What was this view? There's very little in Kalecki on this structuralism, although there's no doubt that many structuralists were very influenced by Kalecki's works, where the two sets of ideas collided or came into confrontation was over Cuba. This is a very interesting case. I think that's whose significance for development economics is, I think, missing in the collected works of Kalecki, where you can read these papers. But let me tell you the story of how it actually happened. When the Cuban Revolution took place in 1959, the Cuban government, led by Fidel Castro, appealed to other Latin American economists, in particular the Latin American the economists of ECLAC, or influenced by ECLAC, to come to Cuba to help develop the economy, to industrialize. They were led in particular by one ECLAC economist, Regina Botti, who took over the Central Planning Board, but others were put into the Central Bank and the industrial ministries. The Central Bank at the time, chaired by Che Guevara. Kalecki arrived in Cuba in November 1960 to draw up a 5-year plan for 1961 to 1965. In this, I mean, he called it a hypothetical 5-year plan because he didn't have. He complained bitterly about not being given reliable data. Well, I'll explain later why he wasn't given reliable data. But he recommended that full employment should be achieved. There should be an attempt to get to full employment by 1965, not through industrial investment, but by essentially the repair of existing infrastructure and spending money on housing, schools, and roads, which were very evidently at the time and actually continue to be very heavily in need of repair if anyone has been to Cuba recently. But the interesting thing is that he opposed industrialization at that stage. He said that, and why did he oppose it? Because he believed that there was not enough food to allow for industrialization, for the expansion of wage earners, in particular as workers moved from agriculture into the cities to work on investment projects. There wouldn't be the agricultural surpluses needed to feed the urban population. And land reform in this regard would not help. The majority of the land was, and still to a great extent for those that have been to Cuba, in the form of plantations, and in particular the sugar plantations, which were an export commodity. And again, one didn't want to restrict production of that. He left Cuba in a state of disillusionment, not just because he hadn't been given adequate information, but because the day when he was supposed to present his report, the Che Guevara cancelled the meeting. Why? Because he had to go to organize the resistance to the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kalecki seems to have been completely unaware of this kind of political background and the growing tension between Cuba and the United States. And this disillusionment certainly comes out in the collected works, but not the political background to it, which was the pressure of America, of the Americans on Cuba, and the Bay of Pigs invasion. So let me finish off by with a conclusion about lessons for today, and to be brought out, and to some extent why we need to rethink what Kalecki wrote in 1953. First of all, there was Kalecki's rejection of what some people have called hydraulic Keynesianism, the notion that if you just expand aggregate demand, then you can expand employment and expand supply. This can be done in an industrial economy where there is excess capacity. In a non-industrial economy, in a developing country where there isn't even the capacity, then hydraulic Keynesianism simply leads to inflation as the demand for basic necessities rises and the supply of them is inelastic. The twin constraints of foreign exchange and the inelastic supply of basic necessities, to some extent, still remain, but have been modified. Obviously, we're no longer in the Bretton Woods period. there's a much more of an international market for the supply for food supplies, not necessarily, but not of housing and other commodities. And even now, those international markets are, of course, being disturbed now by talk of tariffs and so on. The Prebisch-Singer thesis, I think, does need modification. It's been, I think, replaced by what's in effect a commodity price super cycle, rather extended cycles of rises in raw materials prices, followed by falls, driven really by complex factors in the or the conjunctures in international commodity markets. But it's certainly it's not the same as the old Prebisch-Singer thesis. Secondly, it also tends to bring with it foreign direct investment, a foreign direct investment which does not diversify the economy, but rather goes into the production of raw materials, commodities, while commodity prices are high. And finally, there is an international monetary cycle, I think now, which is based much more on the US dollar, backed by federal swaps facilities. It's certainly benefiting some of the emerging markets like Brazil, Mexico, and South Korea. This, to some extent, is stabilizing exchange rates, but it's nevertheless exposing developing countries and emerging markets to American monetary policy and the effect of that monetary policy on the growing international debt of developing countries, and this is another problem for developing countries that needs to be taken into consideration. I'll finish off there. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for sharing this.
Well, I have a lot of comments or questions, more questions and comments, but I'm gonna open a session of questions or comments. Okay, can we get the microphone? Thank you. Thank you, Edgar. Manuel, Professor Gabriel, someone else? Wait. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you.
Is it on? No. Okay. No. Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoy both presentations a lot. I have a common question for you both. You kind of were quite honest and critical towards some of the aspects that you thought that were not so valid anymore about Kalecki's analysis on developing economies. For instance, Professor Noemi, you mentioned that the food inflation, like inflation by food, not so, I mean, right now is not the main problem. I would like from you both like an assessment on, a critical assessment on Kalecki's. What do you think that it's not still valid or is not the main problem? Or if we can translate it to those to understand it in a new way, to kind of actualize these things. I have a specific question, Professor Toporowski. I have a doubt whether this criticism towards socialist economies that he presented in Cuba was the same that he was presenting in Poland, which I don't know if there's some changes, because I know Kalecki made a case-based analysis. So yeah, I was curious to know that. And Professor Levy, I have a question regarding your analysis on Mexico. What do you think it's the main problem of the disjoint cycles between the global capital internalization and the financial flows that you mentioned? Is it the monopoly of the banks? We're talking about Mexico, that most of the commercial banks obtain more from services than from lending activities, or if you think that it's more the policies that the central bank has followed. What do you think is like that makes this decouple between the financial circulation and the global capital that you present as one of the Mexico characteristics?
Thank you, Sean, and Noemi, for this very interesting presentation. I have one question for each of you. For Sean, I was quite surprised to see that Kalecki opposed industrialization in Cuba, which probably made sense looking at the characteristics of the Cuban economy at the time. But he was also proposing investment in infrastructure, which probably demanded imports. So I wonder whether he considered how to pay for those imports, because he was very well aware of the problem of the foreign exchange constraints. So did he imagine some kind of export diversification for the Cuban economy or something like that? And for Noemi, my question is the following. You mentioned the characteristics that the Mexican financial sector and the international financial sector, as also Manuel mentioned, and sometimes my impression is that we have our hands tied. So, but Jose Antonio Campo in particular has been, and Richard Consul Wright and others have been suggesting that there are space for macroprudential policies and for capital controls, or like the IMF says, capital management techniques or something like that, just not to speak of capital control. Do you think this is anyway viable to implement this type of policy?
Well, thank you very much for both presentations. Very interesting. And I have a question for each one. For Noemi, first, you left like a big question at the end. And that is, what should Mexico do in front of the new commercial policy in the United States? Because you said we have to do something about the maquila. We can switch that very easily to some other sector, to some other demand. So what do you think that it should be done in terms of the economic policy regarding what is going on with the Trump administration? I think that it's implicit in your presentation, but you didn't say it so explicitly. So that's the question. For Professor Toporowski, my question has to do with this thing that, as I understand it, this critique of hydraulic Keynesianism has to do, at least in part, with this idea that the Latin America entrepreneurs have different incentives, and they respond differently in Latin America than in the developed world. And that is something that Gabriel and some other people can also say better than me, but that was an issue between Latin American economists before 1953. Specifically, I'm thinking Celso Furtado has already written about that. Also, Aldo Ferrer. Aldo Ferrer is the main Kaleckian Argentinian economist. He worked at the UN with Kalecki between 49 and 53. And they are discussing this subject in part because it is a discussion that comes from the political left. The Communist Party in the whole Latin America has the vision since the 30s that the Latin American economies are characterized by feudal relations. So they're still not proper, full functioning capitalist economies. And the problem there is that there is no bourgeoisie. So it's more a political interpretation. So my question is, what do you think, or if he said anything, what is the position of Kalecki regarding this debate? Because it is so tainted with a political argument more than an economic one. Because the question one has to make is, why do they behave differently? Why the accumulation works so different in Latin America than in Europe or in the United States? That it's like our mirror in which we are looking. We are trying to see, as Marx said, we're trying to see our future, but it's not our future. It's a political answer, or it has to do with some structural economic dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. In the case of Noemi, Levy, there are many data that would be interesting to reflect to every results, not a direct comment or a questions about probably what you present about the Mexican situation is that the main problem is the conflict between rent and profit between financial capital and industrial capital. Is a question in the sense that the rentiers problem, the main conflict is not between capitalists and workers, but probably between rentiers, like a Ricardian idea or not, that because you consider the FDI or foreign capital or multinational that are not connected with the national industrial capital. Is a question about this, about financialization. And for John Toporowski, to comment or question about one is, you say the criticism about hydraulic Keynesianism, and this aspect is probably not only for the different situation in developing countries, but also for the fact that it's important to consider not only demand side, but also supply dynamic in terms of structural change, that the fascinating idea that you have to consider the dynamic within the, demand and supply. That probably this could be the theoretical point about the criticism of hydraulic Keynesianism. And the other point is very interesting. I didn't know about the Cuban experience of Kalecki, and I asked if this kind of failure of the industrialization is probably a common for all communist countries, like that the failure of industrialization is the lack of agricultural modernization, and probably is common for all nowadays Russia. No, the problem is that is consider the richness in terms of only on raw materials and not the industry, because they are not industry, important industry. And it's a very political impact, at the global. Thank you so much.
Yeah, another one. Yeah, yeah.
Very quick. Thank you very much for both presentations. I would like to ask to Professor Toporowski if you could please say a word about the Kalecki work on Bolivia and the intermediate regime.
Well, I want to have a moment because I have maybe open question, or not question, but comment. When I was listening to Professor Noemi, when I see the data and the phenomenon of structural heterogeneity, because that was the main point. All the time when I speak about this phenomenon, I always think about labor market regarding, for example, the work of Timoli and Porcile, who define the structural heterogeneity once as the other phase of this phenomenon is under employment, this phenomenon. So I'd like to, and also Kalecki says something about this, not only inflation pressures, but also about the labor displacement between sectors, and that maybe it was not the main topic of this model, but it is also a very important topic. And the other thing, it's about, or it's an open question about what about political aspects, since Professor Toporowski says that maybe the solution could be a fiscal policy for the rich or the capitalists. I really like this Kalecki's paper, so I'd like to know something more about the political dimension about this. And well, that's it. I think it's too much, so yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Professor Noemi, here.
Before I start answering, I would like to congratulate the organizers for bringing up this paper again for people to read. I think today it's very important. Secondly, I start by order the questions. Manuel, I think Kalecki's, and this is what I try to show, that Kalecki's thinking that the main problem is in the productive sector, with all these structural problem bottlenecks, and this will be reflected in the financial sector, although, and I think he didn't develop this very much, perhaps Jan will correct me, but in his time, we have to think that the financial issues weren't as today are, although he lived after the 1930s. But his objective, and Malcolm may also know that, his objective seems to be very much how to improve or how economic growth should take place. And he was looking very much in the productive sector, acknowledging the importance of the monetary variable, but the monetary variables, although they have their own movement, are not completely free from the productive sector. This is more or less what I want to say about that. Then the main problem of international capitals, when you ask this question, and when Jan was speaking, excess of capital has always been present in our countries. And the situation, when you were speaking about capital flights, this has been an ongoing situation in our country. Why? Yeah, because we get foreign capital controlling from the beginning the most dynamic sector, yeah, and obviously there is a political problem in terms that the class alliances, that the domestic capital ally with them, so they're able to produce or the profit that they produce, yeah, it's very unequally distributed, small capital markets, and you have excess capital either going out or actually not going into the productive sector. I don't know if I could tackle okay, your question. Gabriel, is there space? Yes, there is. I don't know if we can close our economies from the international world or the international market. I'm hesitant about that. With capital controls, if there is an agreement to put capital controls by everyone, yes, we can do it. We cannot do it by our own. There needs, I don't see, you cannot stay out of the international market because once you do it, you are isolated and the difficulty to grow are much higher. See Cuba and Venezuela. Yeah? There is little space. But I would say if I look the last 8 years, yeah, there has been a willingness to change the income structure. There haven't been not great differences, but they started. And if we see today, for instance, the public spending, everyone cries out, it's not, the deficit is not big enough, okay, we have political problems. But the infrastructure construction, it has not happened before. And actually the political issue of all this between from the 1990 to the 2000 has been just to rely on what the international capital says and try to take the best. There hasn't been any domestic power to change things. Perhaps it will change now. It will be slowly because of the political problems towards it. So there is space, but I don't think on this line. Juan, you make the pregunta 64 millones, what to do? The best thing to happen is that TEMEC won't go as it is. It's impossible to grow with this kind of trade agreements. The best solution will be to maintain the industry, which we are very interlinked, car industry, and the high manufacture, but have more space for industrializing. And not only on infrastructures, we need to construct a productive sector that will increase, that will have the multiplier effect to the rest of the economy and increase growth. ¿Cómo se llama the thing that are based the cars? ¿Cómo se llaman los the semiconductors? I have my doubts if they want to do on that way. Why? Because we won't get the latest technology and competition will be very different. So there is a discussion and again, I would say you ask yes, you have a political, I think nothing here is technical. Everything is political. There are class alliances. And this is the main issue to understand. I will, Julio, profits, what has happened in terms of why I say that the main problem has been that we are dominated by foreign capital, allied with the domestic capital, in not think that we cannot blame on the foreign market what's going on in Mexico. It's a problem of Mexico. Usually we blame all over the imperialism or whatever, the problems that we had. I think they're domestic problems. And in this sense, high profits in relation to, Caldo wrote a very nice paper on Chile about that. Yeah, I think this is the situation today in terms that there is no motive to invest in high technological, sort of this Schumpeterian mood doesn't has not existed in Mexico, at least the last 70 years. I want to apologize to putting so many figures, but I try to follow the logic of Kalecki, understanding the Mexican economy. Yeah, you have a problem of bottlenecks. Where are the bottlenecks? How is investment? How is production? How a profit? How and the problem of the external sector, and see what are the contradictions and where we have to work. In this sense, we cannot continue to work in high-tech production without having capital goods. And I think there is a space of negotiating with the big corporation on that lines. I think Julia, I will take, I want to leave space for Jan Toporowski, so I will finish there and then I will speak to Julia, okay? Thanks.
Okay. Okay, thank you for this space. Can I starting off already from the final questions about the political dimension of fiscal policies? I think this is where Kalecki's concept of intermediate regime came in, because he thought he identified in his lifetime as the possibility of an alliance, a social alliance, a class alliance for modernizing the economy. It's interesting that the examples which he gave of Indonesia under Sukarno, India under the Nehrus, Egypt under Nasser. Two of those were semi-military regimes, and I think they had a so I have wondered from time to time what he might have thought of, for example, about Peronism in Argentina, and I think this is for him, Bolivia, the possibility of an intermediate regime in Bolivia was like this. It's a long time since I read that particular paper, so I don't want to go into detail about it, but he saw this possibility in Latin America. I guess the case of Cardenas and PRI as well. PRI certainly in its earlier period. Or in his lifetime, the absence or presence of Latin American entrepreneurs. The interesting thing about Kalecki's analysis of investment giving rise to inflationary pressures is that he considered this would happen whether it was public or private sector investment. He saw this the bottleneck, the basic necessities bottleneck as being a particular difficulty, plus the foreign exchange bottleneck as being a particular difficulty for developing countries, and bottlenecks that would still arise whether it was private sector investment, it was a private sector investment boom, or a government sector boom, government-driven boom. His other issue about private sector investment is, of course, that he was very aware that small or medium-sized businesses are financially constrained, and this is a constraint which doesn't can't be improved through financial development, establishing capital markets, or anything like that. This is something which arises through capital accumulation, but is made worse in developing countries because of the dominance of those pre-capitalist classes who are not particularly entrepreneurial. Kalecki's opposition to industrialization, he wasn't opposed to industrialization, but he thought that it needed long-term planning. And it was certainly similar to his opposition to accelerated industrialization in the communist countries in his time, and in particular the Dobson model, which is sometimes put forward also for developing countries, according to which essentially the more the bigger is the scale of investment, the more you scale up investment now, the greater will be the eventual rise in real wages in the future, except that, as Kalecki consistently pointed out, in the meantime, while you're building all this investment, you've got to feed the workers, or the workers need basic necessities, and that was his fundamental weakness. And I think that the problem with much of the structuralist development is that it justified the accelerated industrialization with a kind of Dobson argument. What is still valid and what is not valid? I actually think that in many respects, the institutions of international finance and the international monetary system have definitely changed from Kalecki's time to now. Certainly we no longer have Bretton Woods, but we still have the International Monetary Fund. There is still the World Bank, which was around at his time. But I think theoretically, the key element in Kalecki that is still valid today is the approach to development economics and development finance as a system of monetary circulation, rather than thinking of it as a model in which you can have, which can be tested against data, and which you can use to make predictions. Kalecki was not. Kalecki's attitude was much more that of an engineer. How is this to be organized? What will and then what will be the impact of it on supply and demand in the various markets? Yes, I'll finish there. Thank you very much once again for inviting me here for this really vital conversation.
Well, thank you, all of you. Well, this is the last session for today. Tomorrow will be the last day. For today, we're gonna have a dinner. I know that we eat like recently, but it's part of being in Mexico. So we have a van to take you to the postgraduate. They're gonna, I mean, they can go and back for others, you know. Wow. Yeah, it's not going to be in the roof.
The first floor.
Of the man. No, of the, de la camioneta. Dice que nos vayamos.
You can go in the first, also in the top of it.
So, well, and that's it. Thank you very much. ¿Eh? Sí, ¿verdad? Ay, hablamos mal de todos y yo aquí.